In the quiet town of Springfield, Vermont, life moved at an unhurried pace, with a population barely exceeding 4,000. Springfield had long been considered the kind of place people moved to when they wanted pastry-lined streets, tidy lawns, familiar faces, and a sense that nothing truly bad could happen there. News traveled quickly in this small community, often spreading faster through casual conversation than through the morning paper itself. It was the kind of town where everyone believed they knew one another, and secrets were thought to be impossible to keep. The Hatcher family was well known in Springfield. Richard and Martha Hatcher had settled there 2 decades earlier, back when their children were still young. Richard, now in his early 50s, had built a successful construction business from nothing, earning a reputation as a hard-working and disciplined man. His strict but principled nature commanded respect, especially among his employees. Martha, his wife, worked as a school teacher, gentle, warm, and thoughtful. She was admired by students and colleagues alike. Though kind by nature, she held firm moral values and tried to instill them in her children, even if she did not always understand their choices. Their son, James, 25, was quiet and introspective. After finishing college, he found work at the local library, a job that suited his reserved personality. He preferred books and solitude over crowds and conversation, a trait that often confused his father, who valued ambition and outward drive. James, however, felt no need to live according to expectations that were not his own. His younger sister, Elizabeth, 23, was his complete opposite. Energetic, expressive, and creative. She was studying art and dreamed of a future shaped by imagination rather than stability. Her artistic ambitions frequently clashed with Richard's practical worldview, yet Elizabeth stubbornly followed her own path. In a town like Springfield, gossip was inevitable. Gary, the owner of a cafe on Main Street, was known for always being aware of local happenings. A longtime friend of Richard's, he often visited the Hatcher home. It was Gary who first sensed that something between James and Elizabeth had changed. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, just a subtle tension that lingered whenever they were together. Not long after, Detective Andrea Morris entered the picture. Though she worked in a neighboring city, her reputation as a sharp and relentless investigator was well known. Her ability to notice details others overlooked had helped her solve some of the region's most complex cases. Soon, those skills would be tested once again. The story began quietly, like a calm river before a storm, but beneath the surface, forbidden emotions, buried secrets, and lies were already pulling everyone toward a devastating outcome. Springfield, so peaceful on the outside, was about to become the stage for a tragedy no one could have predicted. Gary's unease grew over time. James and Elizabeth began spending an unusual amount of time together, often in secluded areas, the riverbank, an abandoned chapel, and eventually an old barn hidden by forest trails. One evening, Gary saw them sitting closely in his cafe, their conversation hushed, their gestures intimate in a way that went beyond sibling affection. When James touched Elizabeth's hand and they left quickly, avoiding eye contact, Gary felt a chill settle in his chest. Weeks passed, and the pattern continued. One evening, driven by concern, Gary followed them to the old barn, hidden among the trees. He watched them disappear inside. When they finally emerged, their expressions reflected both relief and fear. That night, Gary could not sleep. He wrestled with the question of whether to speak up, knowing that doing so could destroy a family he cared about. Eventually, he confided in Detective Maurice. Though unsure whether a crime had been committed, he was convinced something was deeply wrong. Maurice listened carefully, her analytical instincts immediately engaged. She agreed to look into the matter discreetly. Inside the Hatcher household, tension escalated. James grew increasingly distant, Elizabeth anxious and irritable. Conversations with their parents became strained. One evening at dinner, Richard confronted them, demanding honesty. The silence, the exchanged glances, the trembling hands all confirmed his fear that something serious was being hidden. Elizabeth fled the table, and the family fractured further. As Detective Morris quietly observed and gathered information, James and Elizabeth reached a breaking point. Their secret relationship had become unbearable. Convinced that exposure was inevitable, Elizabeth proposed a desperate solution: leave town and start over somewhere no one knew them. The idea terrified James, But the thought of losing Elizabeth terrified him more. They began preparing to flee. Dawn on the night they planned to escape. Everything collapsed. As they moved quietly toward the back door with packed bags, Richard confronted them. Words turned sharp, emotions spiraled, and in a moment of panic and desperation, James shoved his father. Richard fell down the stairs, striking his head. The sound was final. When Elizabeth screamed and rushed to him, it was already too late. Realizing what they had done, the siblings fled, abandoning their plan for a new life and replacing it with a frantic escape from justice. Their freedom was short-lived. They were soon captured, separated, and charged. Detective Morris took over the investigation. Evidence was overwhelming: blood traces, financial records, witness accounts. What began as suspicion turned into a confirmed homicide. During the trial, the full truth emerged, shocking the nation. James and Elizabeth were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms without parole. For Martha Hatcher, the verdict marked the end of everything she had known. Her home became a hollow reminder of love lost and warnings ignored. Springfield slowly returned to routine, but the memory of the Hatcher tragedy lingered like a scar. The case became a chilling reminder that even the quietest towns can hide the darkest secrets, and that running from the truth often leads to consequences far worse than facing it. The abandoned Hatcher house still stands as a symbol of that truth. Springfield, Vermont, was the kind of town people moved to when they wanted peace. Mornings began with the sound of birds instead of traffic, and nights were quiet enough that you could hear the wind move through the trees. Children rode bicycles without fear. Doors were often left unlocked, and neighbors trusted one another without question. Crime was something people watched on television, not something they expected to experience firsthand. When something unusual happened, it became the topic of conversation for weeks. People believed they knew the rhythm of the town and, more importantly, the people who lived in it. That belief made what happened later even more disturbing, because it proved how easily darkness can hide behind familiar faces. The Hatcher family seemed to represent everything Springfield stood for. Richard Hatcher was known as a hard-working businessman who believed success was earned, not given. He woke before sunrise, managed construction sites all day, and still found time to attend community meetings. Many saw him as strict, even intimidating, but no one questioned his integrity. Martha balanced his firm personality with warmth and patience. As a teacher, she was admired for her dedication and compassion, often staying late to help struggling students. Their home was orderly, disciplined, and outwardly stable. But behind closed doors, subtle cracks had begun to form. Conversations grew shorter, smiles fell forced, and family dinners slowly turned into quiet, uncomfortable routines. Though nothing appeared broken on the surface, tension had started to settle into the walls of the house. James and Elizabeth, despite being close in age, lived very different emotional lives. James had always felt overshadowed by his father's expectations. He was intelligent and thoughtful, but he carried a constant sense of disappointment, believing he would never be enough in Richard's eyes. His job at the library gave him comfort, but it also fueled his insecurity, as he felt judged for choosing a quieter path. Elizabeth, on the other hand, burned with passion and creativity. She expressed herself through art, color, and emotion, refusing to conform to what others wanted her to be. Her refusal to follow a traditional path often led to arguments at home, especially with Richard, who feared her dreams would lead to failure. What neither parent fully understood was how deeply their children relied on each other emotionally. Over time, that bond crossed a dangerous line, one built on secrecy, fear, and a desperate need for understanding. And it was within that fragile emotional space that the tragedy quietly began to grow. By the time James and Elizabeth reached adulthood, the bond between them had evolved into something far more complex and intense than the casual affection most siblings share. A connection forged over years of shared secrets, whispered conversations in the quiet corners of their home, and a constant feeling of being misunderstood or judged by those around them, especially their father, Richard, whose stern principles and relentless expectations weighed heavily on their shoulders, and whose perception of morality left little room for individuality or deviation from the path he deemed acceptable. James, a young man of 25, had always been introspective and withdrawn, preferring the company of books, knowledge, and the quiet rhythm of the library where he worked, rather than the distractions and trivialities of social life. While Elizabeth, 2 years his junior, thrived on creativity, expression, and the vibrancy of art, a pursuit her father dismissed as unstable and futile, though it brought her the only true joy she felt in a world otherwise dominated by rules, judgment, and restraint. Their childhood had been marked by the ordinary joys and occasional conflicts of family life, yet beneath the surface, subtle tensions simmered. James's quiet demeanor clashed with Richard's demands for engagement and initiative, while Elizabeth's vibrant personality and defiance of conventional expectations often triggered harsh criticisms that left emotional scars, gradually shaping a dynamic between the siblings in which they became each other's confidants, protectors, and in many ways, sole sources of understanding and acceptance in a world that seemed hostile or incomprehensible. Over time, the closeness that began as simple sibling support grew into a dependency that neither fully recognized at first, but which gradually mutated into something darker and more consuming. A connection they desperately tried to hide from friends, neighbors, and most of all, their parents, yet which became increasingly impossible to conceal as subtle behaviors. Secretive meetings and furtive touches began to accumulate into patterns that, to an outside observer like Gary, the cafe owner and longtime friend of the family, suggested a bond far beyond ordinary sibling affection, a realization that filled him with anxiety and moral conflict. Torn between loyalty to his friends and fear of the unknown depths their connection might reach, Gary's growing unease, combined with the couple's increasing isolation, secretive escapades to secluded spots along the riverbank and the abandoned chapel, and their obsessive preoccupation with each other, formed a perfect storm of tension and unease that ultimately erupted one fateful night, when a minor confrontation, a single push in a moment of desperation, led to the death of Richard Hatcher and the complete collapse of a family that had once been the picture of small-town respectability, leaving behind a trail of chaos, grief, and shock that rippled through the entire community of Springfield. Detective Andrea Morris, known for her keen analytical mind, unwavering persistence, and uncanny ability to see the invisible threads connecting people and events, arrived at the scene quickly, her experience allowing her to immediately sense that this was not merely a tragic accident, but the culmination of months, perhaps years, of tension, secrecy, and forbidden attachment. And she approached the investigation with a mixture of professional detachment and human empathy, understanding that behind the stark evidence of blood, fingerprints, and premeditated plans, there lay deep psychological currents, emotional dependencies, and the tragedy of young lives warped by circumstances, upbringing, and choices that led them down an irrevocable path. James and Elizabeth's flight from their home, their desperate attempt to escape the consequences of a secret they could no longer contain, was as much a flight from themselves as it was from justice. Every step they took was guided by fear, panic, and the delusion that distance and disappearance could erase the moral weight of their actions. Yet as they were ultimately apprehended, separated in custody, and confronted with the full reality of their crime, the enormity of what they had done sank in, crushing them under guilt, regret, and a profound understanding that some secrets, no matter how passionately or desperately protected, are impossible to outrun. In the weeks and months that followed, the trial of James and Elizabeth gripped national attention, a case study in how familial affection, misunderstood emotions, and secrecy can evolve into catastrophe. As the courtroom filled with evidence fingerprints, financial transactions suggesting premeditated escape, eyewitness accounts, and the forensic confirmation of the cause of death all converged to paint a chilling portrait of premeditated, impulsive, yet tragically inevitable acts that shattered a family and a community, leaving everyone involved to grapple with questions of morality, human nature, and the fragile boundaries of familial love. Marta, Cheer, left alone in the once cozy home that had become an emblem of loss, spent her days surrounded by silence and memories, each room echoing with the laughter, arguments, and ordinary domestic rhythms that had existed before the storm, now haunting reminders of what had been destroyed, her grief compounded by the understanding that despite her love, guidance, and care, there were depths within her children that she could neither foresee nor control, and that the tragedy that had befallen them was the intersection of human emotion, choice, and secrecy in ways that defied comprehension. Meanwhile, James and Elizabeth, isolated in separate prison cells, faced the relentless weight of their decisions. Each day, an unyielding reminder of the paths they had chosen, the people they had lost, and the society from which they were forever severed. Their lives now reduced to reflection, remorse, and the slow erosion of freedom and identity. A haunting testament to the fact that forbidden desires and hidden truths, when left unchecked, can escalate into outcomes so extreme that even the most ordinary families, in the quietest of towns, can become the stage for unimaginable tragedy. The story of the Hatcher family, which began with the semblance of a peaceful, idyllic life in Springfield, serves as an enduring cautionary tale that beneath neat lawns, friendly neighbors, and calm appearances, human emotions can twist and collide in ways that no community can fully anticipate or contain. That secrets, especially those born of love, fear, and desperation, can fester into destruction, and that the line between ordinary family dynamics and catastrophic tragedy is far thinner than anyone could imagine, leaving a legacy of grief, warning, and unanswerable questions that linger long after the public spectacle fades. A stark reminder that some human impulses, once acted upon, are impossible to reverse, and that the shadows behind closed doors may hide horrors far beyond what is ever spoken aloud.